Hi guys, I know it's been forever since I last posted. I was in the process of moving, but I'm officially back. Today we're talking about one of the strangest cases I have ever researched. I know I say that about everything, but just hear me out. In April of 2003, Colonel Philip Michael Shue kissed his wife goodbye, left for work, and 2 hours later was killed in a violent car accident. His death was quickly ruled a suicide, but those closest to him, even the lead investigator on the case, believe something much more sinister took place. The deeper I got into this case, the more questions I had, and there's a lot to cover, so let's just get right into it. Colonel Philip Michael Shue was born on July 22, 1948, and was raised in Brickville, Ohio. After graduating in 1970 from the University of Wisconsin with a Bachelor of Science degree in pre-med, he entered the United States Air Force, where over the years he became a highly regarded psychiatrist. Everyone who knew him loved him. Everyone who described him said he was one of the most loyal, respectful, and professional people you would ever meet. In 1988, Philip was stationed at the Eglin Air Force Base in Florida when he met the love of his life, Tracy. Tracy was an Air Force nurse at the base. At the time, Philip was going through a nasty divorce from his first wife, Nancy, and although he didn't talk much about her, he did say that there was just no love in that relationship. So needless to say, when the divorce was finalized in 1993, he was over the top excited, and it was at this point that he and Tracy decided to get married. Fast forward to 5 years later. In 1998, Philip was reassigned to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. Together, he and Tracy bought a home in Boerne, and life was just overall really great for them. They spent the next few years just going through the motions of life, and in April of 2003, Philip decided it was time to retire from the Air Force. He was 54 years old. He planned to just finish up his work, and by September, the two would move to their absolute dream home in Birmingham, Alabama. In fact, they had literally just put down the deposit to secure the house. It was a huge home with a pond in the backyard, and it was just everything the couple could have wanted. But on the morning of April 16th, 2003, their lives would change forever. The morning started out just like any other. Philip dressed in his military fatigues, and he brought Tracy her routine cup of coffee in bed. Philip said he had to get to work a little earlier than usual to finish up some paperwork, so at around 5:30 in the morning, he kissed his wife goodbye, told her he loved her, and headed out the door. But just 2 hours later, he was found dead. He never made it into his office, which was 30 miles away, and to this day, no one knows where he was until his accident 2 hours later. At around 8:14 that morning, two witnesses saw Philip's tan Mercury Tracer swerve onto the median of Interstate 10 just outside of San Antonio. His car then drove for about 1,500 feet, going about 60 miles per hour, and at one point, he even became airborne before slamming back down onto the highway. Philip was then seen driving safely for several miles before veering off the side of the road and directly into a cluster of oak trees. When authorities arrived on scene, they found Philip dressed in his military fatigues. His car was completely caved in on the driver's side, and he suffered massive head injuries. He appeared to have died on impact, but this is where things start to get really strange. Philip had no wallet or ID on him, and upon looking closer, authorities found that his body had been mutilated prior to the crash. The t-shirt Philip was wearing underneath his military clothing was cut open from his chest to his belly button, and under that was a 6-inch vertical gash on his chest. Both of his nipples had been surgically removed, and not only that, but his left pinky and part of his earlobe had been amputated. And all of those body parts were never found. Just when I thought that things couldn't get any stranger though, authorities also found that both of Philip's wrists and his boots had been wrapped in duct tape. It was kind of like he'd been bound at one point, but had broken loose. Here's the part where all of my questions come in. So Philip was found dead at around 8:30 in the morning, but his wife Tracy wasn't actually notified about his death until about 7 hours later when a sheriff and a minister just showed up at her house. But even when she was notified, authorities were really tight-lipped and just chose not to mention anything about the mutilation. And when a worker with the Department of Public Safety arrived at her home a few hours later, they blurted something out that made Tracy stop in her tracks. The worker said, "Oh, by the way, is there any reason your husband would have duct tape around his wrists and ankles?" And that's when Tracy remembered something that would turn this investigation upside down. In the years prior to his death, Philip began receiving a series of letters warning him that his life may be in danger. I found a copy of one of the letters, which is what you're looking at right now. In the letter, an unknown person writes to Philip stating that a friend of theirs overheard Philip's ex-wife Nancy and her current husband Don wishing he was dead so that they could collect on his life insurance. To kind of back up, as part of Philip and Nancy's divorce settlement, Nancy had won the right to own his life insurance policies, which totaled $1 million. Over the years following the divorce, Philip would beg Nancy to cancel the policies, but she always told him no and that she just couldn't afford to. So once he received these letters, Philip actually wrote to Nancy and confronted her about the warnings. She of course denied any involvement and said she had no clue what he was talking about. According to Tracy, these letters really scared Philip, and after each letter, he became more and more scared for his life. So he gave these letters to his superiors in the Air Force, and they concluded that they didn't actually hold any harm or danger and told him to basically just ignore them. He even reached out to the insurance companies, which were USAA and Northwestern Mutual, and asked them to cancel the policies. But they always responded that since Nancy was the owner of the policies, she had total authority over them. But like I said, Philip was terrified for his life and even began experiencing panic attacks. So he eventually wrote a letter to the insurance companies. He said, quote, "Thoroughly examine my death for evidence of foul play, even if on the surface the cause would appear natural or accidental," end quote. But despite all of his pleading, the insurance companies refused to cancel the policies. So when asked if there would be any reason why Philip's wrists and ankles were wrapped in duct tape, Tracy remembered the threatening letters and handed them over to the police. She let them search the property for clues and hoped that in doing so, something would come of it. But unfortunately, it did not. It wasn't until a little more than a month after Philip's funeral that a reporter reached out to Tracy asking for a comment about his mutilated body. Up until this point, nobody had told her that his body had been mutilated. I just can't imagine finding this information out this way. Not by police, not by the Air Force, but by some random reporter a month after his funeral. This information alone reassured Tracy this was not an accident, but that Philip was murdered, and it was somehow connected to those letters. During the investigation, an autopsy was conducted by the Bexar County Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Vincent DeMayo, and his findings only pose more questions. A small amount of white fiber material consistent with that of a diaper was found on Philip's groin area. Also found in that same area was a little tab with a cartoon figure of a sun and a moon, which is also consistent with a tab from a diaper. But Philip didn't wear diapers, and nowhere in the car was a diaper found, so how that material got on him is still unknown. A high concentration of lidocaine, which is an anesthetic, was found in Philip's blood, and originally it was thought to have come from a cream that would be rubbed onto the skin. However, there's usually another ingredient in that cream that would also show in the toxicology, but it didn't. So somehow prior to his death, Philip was injected with lidocaine. It seems pretty black and white that whatever happened to Philip was not accidental or by his own doing. But despite all of that, after 1 year of investigating, the local and state police and the Air Force all concluded that Philip died by suicide. They labeled Philip's death as suicide, but more specifically a, quote, bizarre psychological breakdown, end quote. Chief Medical Examiner Dr. DeMayo officially ruled that despite the odd mutilations on Philip's body, there were no wounds identified as being consistent with a struggle. He, along with the Air Force and state police, believe 100% that the injuries found on Philip's chest were self-inflicted. Dr. DeMayo is very vocal about his opinions on what he thinks happened that day. He questions why Philip didn't call for help. The narrative was really pushed that there was no evidence that he tried to call for help, but that's not entirely true. After the crash, for some reason that I can't find, Philip's phone was given to his and Tracy's neighbor before being given back to her. And according to both of them, there was a large amount of blood on the inside of Philip's phone, as if he had held the phone up to his partially amputated ear to maybe try and call for help. Authorities also pushed that his phone was in working order, but that's never been confirmed. It's also extremely fair to assume that you would never know exactly what you're gonna do when in a crazy situation like this. What is odd that I do think should be pointed out is that the exact location that Philip was driving before he crashed was technically away from help. He was driving away from San Antonio and a few hospitals and police stations, and he actually passed a state trooper on the highway. Philip also passed 3 exits to his home in Boerne. But again, no one knows exactly what was going through Philip's head at the time. And if he had just been tortured and or escaped from someone, he likely was not thinking rationally. Regarding the lidocaine found in Philip's blood, Dr. DeMayo believes that he injected himself with the anesthetic to avoid feeling the pain of mutilating his own body. According to him, hesitation marks were found next to the gaping wound on Philip's chest, which helped him conclude that the injuries were self-inflicted. Tracy, and even Philip's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Chosinski, believed that Philip did not die by suicide, but instead was abducted and tortured, and that he accidentally crashed the car, which resulted in his death when trying to escape. 2 months after Philip's death, Tracy filed a civil lawsuit against Nancy and the 2 insurance companies, trying to prevent Nancy from being able to collect on Philip's $1 million death benefit. Nancy herself has refused to answer any questions regarding her ex-husband's death. She's taken the fifth more than 20 times on the grounds that any response might incriminate her. She also refused to take a polygraph, but she did tell investigators that on the day of Philip's death, she and her current husband could prove that they were at work in Florida. I'm not sure if authorities ever investigated that claim or not, but I sure hope so, and I would like to believe they did. One thing that I want to note, and only because it will pop up if you research this case, is that Tracy believes that the nature of Philip's injuries could be a clue. His injuries could be described as sexual in nature, and court documents show that Nancy was a board-certified sex therapist who also studied the practice of sadomasochism. Sadomasochism is the sexual gratification from inflicting physical pain or humiliation on another person or yourself. When asked if Philip ever had any type of similar fetish, Tracy said no. I know this might be a reach, but if I didn't include it, someone would drag me for it, so take that information as you will. A lot of people very openly advocated for Philip's death to be reinvestigated, and as a result, his case was actually brought to a jury of 12 citizens sworn to secrecy. But given the evidence, they all concluded that the suicide ruling should stand. This was obviously a huge blow to Tracy and her effort in getting Philip the justice he deserves, but this didn't stop her from fighting. Tracy went on to independently hire a forensic pathologist to complete a second autopsy with fresh eyes. The doctor she hired is world-renowned Dr. Cyril Wetched, who is well known for working on several high-profile cases like the assassination of John F. Kennedy, John Benet Ramsey, and Lacey Peterson. From his investigation, Dr. Wetch concluded that the evidence presented in the initial autopsy does not support suicide, but rather is suggestive that another person may have been involved in his death. He noted that there were no fingerprints on any of the duct tape found on Philip, which to him indicates another person was involved. He also brought up the fact that there was no cutting instrument found in the car that was responsible for Philip's injuries. Adding on to that, Philip's wallet and ID, his nipples, his left pinky, and part of his earlobe were never found, leading Dr. Wetch to conclude that this trauma happened somewhere outside of the vehicle and that another person caused it. One major point brought up by Dr. Wetch that I think really supports the theory that someone else was involved is the fact that there was no injection site identified on his body by the original pathologist. The drug would have had to be injected into each nipple and in the middle of his chest, but the original pathologist didn't identify any of that. And although there was a high concentration of lidocaine found in his blood, it wasn't high enough to numb himself from the pain, which almost disproves Dr. DeMayo's theory that Philip numbed himself before mutilating his own chest, which there's also no evidence of. 2 years after Philip's death, the military issued a 20-page report and called it a psychological autopsy. In it, they basically just reiterate all of the findings from the previous investigations into the case. Their conclusion was that Philip had become paranoid, depressed, and irrational in the months before his death and agreed that his death should be labeled a suicide. But there's one majorly important person that strongly disagrees with this finding, and that is Philip's own psychiatrist. Like I mentioned previously, when Philip started receiving those letters, he became scared for his life and developed major anxiety as a result. So he started seeing Dr. Douglas Dione for treatment. In his own words, he strongly disagrees with the finding that Philip died by suicide. According to Dr. Dione, Philip was prescribed clonazepam and venlafaxine at the time of his death, which could result in suicidal tendencies. However, neither of those drugs were found in his system during the autopsy, which means at some point well before his death, he stopped taking them. Dr. Dione mentioned that Philip was responding really well to treatment and never showcased any suicidal ideations. He was very much looking forward to the next chapter in his life after retirement. One thing that is noteworthy, though, is that 6 months before Philip died, he told Dr. Dione about a disturbing nightmare he had. In the nightmare, he was in his car, which went out of control on his way to work, and, quote, great violence was done to him, end quote. It seemed that to those closest to Philip and to those who knew him best, Philip was murdered, but there was no movement in his case, and it wasn't really being paid attention to. So Tracy began working with Joe Mora, a highly regarded private investigator. So Joe is probably the most well-known for working on the Madeleine McCann case. Joe flew out to Boerne, Texas, and started investigating Philip's death. During his investigation, Joe found that the lead investigator on the case, whose name is Roger Anderson, didn't even preserve the scene of the crash or Philip's vehicle. And at the time, it was highlighted in almost every article about this case that Roger had some beef with the state police and a few arguments broke out. Roger stated that despite the mutilations to Philip's body, quote, "The situation wasn't handled as if it was a crime scene. I am guilty. I was in charge of the investigation. There is a lot of fault to go around, but in the end, it's mine. Evidence may have been lost, leads may have been ignored. There was no investigation," end quote. Roger is now one of Tracy's biggest supporters and believes that someone else was involved in the death of Philip. Joe also found and interviewed the two witnesses that saw Philip crash that morning. According to them, they were never even contacted by Air Force investigators. Joe went on to say that there is absolutely no evidence that points to suicide, and what little evidence there is points to money and anger being possible motives. Following Tracy's lawsuit, in June of 2008, Nancy and both USAA and Northwestern Mutual were all dropped. As a result, Nancy received $1 million and Tracy ended up receiving $1.8 million. During the trial, Judge Bill Palmer ruled in favor of the two insurance companies and found they did nothing wrong in refusing to cancel Philip's policies when he asked. But something happened next that was completely unexpected. Judge Bill Palmer announced to the courtroom that based on the evidence considered by the court, Colonel Philip Michael Shue was murdered, therefore finding that his April 16, 2003 death was actually a homicide. After years of fighting for her husband, Tracy felt relieved that someone who actually has power was finally on her side, that all of the evidence did in fact point to murder. But that relief didn't last long, and let me tell you why. Despite Judge Palmer's order to reopen the case and to change Philip's death certificate from suicide to homicide, Kendall County officials refused to do so. It appears that Kendall County officials have no plans to reinvestigate the case. And sadly, in 2009, the Texas Attorney General officially ruled that Philip's death certificate does not have to be changed. And to this day, Philip's official cause of death remains a suicide. So even though they have multiple doctors, private investigators, the lead investigator on the case, and even a judge telling them that Philip's death was not a suicide, hell, they even had multiple life-threatening letters against Philip presented to them. Kendall County officials have chosen not to reinvestigate Philip's case. This case is a roller coaster, and it's left many wondering what actually happened to Colonel Philip Michael Shue and why it seems like it's being covered up. Law enforcement has never named Nancy, or anyone for that matter, as a suspect or person of interest in this case. Some believe that Philip staged the attack and just accidentally killed himself, but so many others believe he was abducted, taken to a second location, tortured, and died while trying to get away. Unfortunately, I think this is one of those cases that we might never have the answer to. Despite the outcome, Tracy is still working hard to advocate for her husband. She, along with a few others, created a website called Military Families for Justice, with the goal of giving bereaved military families a voice in the legal process for death investigations of their loved ones. You can also follow the Colonel Philip Michael Shue Facebook page for little updates, which is run by Tracy. It will give you a really good insight into how wonderful of a person Philip was. I don't know what to personally think of this case, other than the fact that none of it makes sense, but I am interested to know what you guys think. Anyways, thank you all for listening. Feel free to leave a case request in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time. But until then, stay safe.